Hi, everyone. Hi, Chuck. Thanks for joining us on A Players today. We'll be talking about how to build a scalable and repeatable process to hire salespeople. We'll be mentioning a few recipes, few books, and we'll be talking about your own experience as a salesperson yourself, and then sales manager, and now helping companies hire salespeople. So, very glad to have you here with us today. Can you start by introducing yourself and Blueprint Expansion? Tell us a bit more about your background, and then we'll dive into the topic.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks, Robin. Appreciate you having me on your podcast. So I'm Chuck Brotman. I co-founded Blueprint Expansion. We are a 5-person now recruiting agency that helps mostly early stage companies with go-to-market roles hiring, so sales, marketing, and customer success roles. We've worked with over 50 companies in the last 2.5 plus years. Prior to starting the agency, I was a VP of sales in 2 other organizations and worked over 13 years at a company called On24 in various sales and sales management and pre-sales roles. So a lot of experience, coming up through the SaaS world and now on the agency side of things.
Nice. And what I really enjoy during our conversation is that you're able to quote things from your own experience, from the books that you read and from what you're seeing with your clients now. So you have that both very down in the trenches experience, but also like bird's eye view on what's happening with your clients. How do we start on this topic of building a scalable and repeatable process to hire salespeople? What is the number one problem or hurdle that you see that the companies face when they start tackling that problem of hiring more salespeople?
Yeah, for sure. I'll talk about that problem, actually picking up with your comment about the value of my experience. And I know it's a bit cliche, although I think sometimes people lose sight of this, but a big part of the value of my experience is the value of my failures and misses, right? And what I've learned from those misses, which I think have both helped me to sharpen and improve my point of view on what it takes to build great teams. But also it's given me a little bit more empathy for many of the challenges that my clients have. And as you mentioned, one of the key things that we believe is of paramount importance in hiring is building a repeatable process for doing that and establishing that process early. And what's been interesting in the market is seeing, while companies I think have gotten a little bit more, data driven and process oriented when it comes to their sales motions, like too much hiring is happening from the gut. And so what do we mean by that? Well, at a fundamental level, it starts with sort of knowing what core things need to be in place before you start to interview and hire talent. It means a great job description, defining an ideal candidate profile, and putting together a process that's built for speed, but also thoughtfulness in running an assessment and giving candidates the opportunity to vet you. And those are things that we see many companies are either doing reactively or not doing at all. So, first and foremost, we really coach and advise our clients to put together strong, repeatable processes, starting with defining their fundamentals and then building in an execution strategy to source great talent against the profiles they've built, to calibrate against those, through whatever channels they're using to source talent, and then to continue to move folks through to offer and start. So that's kind of where it all begins. And again, a lot of the challenges that we've seen in the market is that, companies start trying to move forward, from the gut or without having well-documented processes with defined SLAs around their own turnaround times and their accountability to other personnel involved in the process of hiring.
All right. So there is role scoping and ideal candidate profile building. So that's the first part, the preparation. We often see that a lot of companies just miss and jump this step altogether. Just say, okay, I need salespeople. So obviously I'll just take the person that has done that job in another company.
Yes.
I want to be thinking more about it. So let's move on to the next step. Maybe we can take a bit of time on this. So how to build the ideal candidate profile. What's your advice? How to do this? Then there's sourcing. So how do you write a great job description? Salespeople, a lot of them, you'll need to engage with them over LinkedIn, proactively send them emails. So you probably have some tips as well on the sourcing. And then the interview process, which is an entire thing altogether, like how do you optimize for speed, as you said, thoughtfulness, assessment, but also reverse assessment that a candidate can assess you. So let's maybe start with a kickoff, a job description, and ideal candidate profile, and then we'll move on to the next steps chronologically.
Yeah, I think at a fundamental level, it really does start with thinking about both your job description and your candidate profile with kind of 3 core things in mind. And first, it's understanding, and this may seem like we're stating the obvious here, but what are the problems that you solve in the market and why do they matter, and what do successful outcomes look like for your customers, and how well can you articulate that for yourself in your job description, right? So understanding like your business profile and why the work you do matters, much like you would articulate in a pitch deck if you're trying to raise capital. Number two is understanding within that context, what are the role requirements you need for success that helps drive that mission forward, right? If it's acquisition sales or pipeline creation at the top of the funnel, or driving utilization and customer success, whatever that is. So understanding what is the role, what does success look like in role, what does your company do, and why does it even matter, right? And then third, sort of what's your maturity and culture? What does that mean in terms of the kinds of values and behaviors that yield successful role execution for the business? So it's the three legs of the stool. I talk to candidates all the time about thinking about their requirements in their search. I recommend companies think about that. And the reason I start with that is because once a company has done that, if they've done it well, it really helps to enable more thoughtfulness around what do we need in terms of prior experience versus what can we enable in the organization, right? And then also, what kinds of attributes are we looking for in candidates out there? An interesting thing I see often when you have this exercise with companies is they'll tell you, well, we want to hire people with industry experience. But then you probe and you'll learn that actually some of the most successful evangelists in the business didn't have industry experience, right? And so you're able to uncover, wait a minute, you want to hire for this, yet some of your biggest contributors knew nothing, including oftentimes the founders of these companies, right? I mean, look at some of the biggest success stories in SaaS. These aren't people who were born and raised to solve specific problems, right? They found them and through curiosity and intellect, they were able to build great solutions, right? And that's how you have to think about your hiring. And the more that you can do that, it really helps you identify what exactly do you want to look for in terms of those behaviors and skills. Obviously, depending on the role type, you need prior experience in many cases, right? If you're hiring an enterprise seller, you probably need to find somebody that's accustomed to carrying, enterprise level sales quotas, who's closed, net new business in Fortune 500 companies or expanded it, right? So I'm not saying that everything is about hiring for potential. But if you can really lay down kind of what is that role, what are you doing in the market, right? And then what are your values and maturity, that foundation that helps you build that profile thoughtfully, not too constrained, but also with rigor, right? To enable getting that search actually going.
There's a lot to say on the discovery process, so much that we have an entire A Players episode dedicated to it in episode 33 with James Donovan. He also shares the kickoff template that he uses. In sales in particular, there are a few questions that always come back because people tend to replicate. So they have this picture of the person they want, and they say, I want exactly the person that has done this before, right? So I'm selling, I don't know if I'm selling a enterprise SaaS for doctors. I want somebody who's done it before. So I'll ask a few questions, and you'll tell me if you have opinions or ideas or sources about this. Number one is prior industry experience. You already replied more or less to this one. Then there is for especially hiring at different stages of the company. So early stage startup, hiring a top seller at a large corporate.
Yep.
What do you think about that? Those are the two questions I have in mind mostly for. And are there other traps that you see, like all companies say, we want somebody who's done this, and they all think the same. And sometimes it's not a good way to think about it. So are there other traps in the discovery and profile building phase?
Yeah, maybe if I can just briefly come back to the industry piece. One comment I was going to make using the example of, assume a company in the healthcare tech space that maybe is enabling, better, patient experience services or minimizing the impact of bureaucracy for a certain segment of healthcare. A company can say, hey, we need to find somebody who's done that, or they can look for the core skills and curiosities and perhaps find somebody who hasn't done that, but had a family member who was impacted by terrible patient experience because of bureaucracy and red tape, and who's passionate about the importance of those kind of problems from a societal perspective, and understanding through that experience how that can yield more business growth, right? So, just a good example where, even when you're trying to get appropriately narrow and finding people who will understand your charter, companies do this the wrong way. And we call that the industry insider fallacy, right? Which again, we see a lot. On the maturity side, I would say the same thing, right? So on the one hand, I think if a company has 20 employees and 2 salespeople and they're looking to hire salesperson number 3, you have to make sure this person is going to have, stage fitness, right? And that means, are they often, not always, but are they comfortable with ambiguity, right? Can they wear the proverbial multiple hats? Will they be okay with fast pivots, right? Are they going to need, too much structure, like tightly defined territories? How will they react to things change? So I think it's certainly appropriate to vet and assess talent for that. And I do think in many cases, if somebody has been, in IBM and Oracle their entire career, that is going to be more challenging for them, right? And so I think it's fair to sort of ask probing questions if that person has an interest. But here as well, I wouldn't sort of uniformly screen people like that out, right? Be clear in your job descriptions what this entails. Be clear about your values and your lack of maturity, right? Build that into your assessment process. And be open to folks who maybe don't have that background on paper, because who knows, maybe somebody worked for an accelerator or startup within the IBM or Oracle families and knows that more than you might realize, but you didn't take the 15 minutes to have that screening call with that candidate.
One advice that we often hear about defining the role and the IECP is going to the absolute the most required things, like what's an absolute requirement and that we couldn't do without, and everything else is just a bonus. So don't do this, and don't weed out people because you think they don't have those bonuses, because you always know you can only know if you talk to them. So that's another advice, right?
Totally agree. Yeah.
That person works at Salesforce. You wouldn't thrive into a startup environment, but the thing is, she actually worked in a startup incubator at Salesforce. Maybe she speaks that language that you need, but she didn't put it on her LinkedIn. So ask the question.
Exactly.
Because everybody's going after the same ideal people. There is a lot of competition for those people that just tick all the boxes. And if you just try and move a bit away from the bullseye, people that don't tick necessarily all the boxes on the first side, but maybe they do tick them, but you just don't know because you haven't asked them. So
I think there's an important thing I would add to this, Robin, which is because there's a misconception out there today that, well, there's truth to it, but it's also a misconception. That is that we've had the sudden market shift from being, a candidate's market to a hiring company's market, right? And granted, yes, there is a lot more talent on the market. In some cases, like a lot of talent to choose from, right? But the problem is that it's almost what companies are doing is because there's so much talent and limited internal resources to vet, right? They're narrowing that profile more and almost creating the illusion that's going to help them find the best possible people in a buyer's market. But it's almost like they're just throwing darts at a board, right? And they're not. Will that work in some cases? Absolutely. But what they're really doing that we see time and again is they're screening out exceptional talent on the market today because of the very conditions that they should be taking advantage of. But because they don't have resources or the competencies or both, right? They're just kind of arbitrarily tightening things and losing great people. And, I'm convinced like the best companies out there now are so invested in repeatable hiring and finding the best and not reverting to credentialism or over-reliance on the network. We're saying, look, we're going to thoughtfully go after people. We're not going to change and pivot how we think about what worked for us in the past, because we're going to find even better instances of that today.
Got it. So that's for building the ideal candidate profile. Going through all, and again, there is an entire episode to do just on this. And then moving on to sourcing. How do you get candidates? How do you write job postings that engage and that get applicants? How do you engage with people over LinkedIn, email? I don't know. How do you generate candidates? And then we'll talk about the process.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the most important thing is not over-indexing on any singular channel, right? Because great candidates can come from all different places. On the one hand, we see some companies that are moving to, and I think we might talk about this maybe in a bit, but moving to a focus on hiring only from their network or only hiring past employees, right? Can you find exceptional people that way? Absolutely, right? I've had a lot of success with that, but you may find that some exceptional talent just happens to find your job posted on a job board and applies with the easy apply button, right? If you're ignoring that you're doing that at your own peril. So I think looking at your inbound, looking at your networks, looking at referrals from employees, from advisors and investors, and then also like running traditional forms of outbound using platforms that can help support reaching out to folks who may be actively in search, maybe are passive candidates at companies that had cuts, maybe at companies that had no cuts at all and they're doing well, but you pique their curiosity with a well-timed message. And you've got a great story, like you should be talking to those folks too. So, we recommend having, a diversified strategy to find great people, not over relying on one channel or over indexing on it because of, again, this perception that, that the market has changed. So you don't need to do, X, Y, and Z anymore.
There is something that you said, maybe you can reach out to that person who's in the company doing well and you just pick their interest. How do you pick their interest? What do you share? Sales, there is a lot of data that you can share. So do you share OTE? Do you share, I don't know, average contract value? What do you share yourself in your outreach message, or what do you recommend that people share?
Yeah, we have different schools of thought even within Blueprint. But when I'm sourcing, first and foremost, it's always about what the company does and why it matters. And if I can't articulate that, it's going to be challenging, right? I always want to begin there, because to me, I suppose that's where when I put my sort of job seeker hat on, that's what I first and foremost care about. And does that look interesting? So I always want to have that in my messaging. I think compensation, OTE, like those salient details, like we got to move past the world of like conversation required to learn what the comp range is, right? So we want to have comp range, an overview of benefits, if there's territory specifics, any kind of key growth numbers that can be shared. And then a little bit on what the ideal candidate profile looks like, right? That's where I show this individual kind of why we're reaching out to them. I'm not a big believer in like, sort of personalizing every single outreach message. If I don't know you, I can't really say your background looks interesting, right? But I can be thoughtful in terms of, sort of helping you connect the dots by telling you, this is what we're looking for, right? Here's what the company does. Here's the compensation. You can now see why I'm engaging you. And maybe it's something I think you might want to pursue. Maybe it's something I might ask you if you want to refer to others. But those are generally core components: value prop, kind of role specifics, and then next steps, right? So, if you can send a referral, or, if you've got time to chat, we'll ask for that as well.
All right. And do you have advice on job postings as well? Like how to write postings that convert and drive applicants?
Yeah, I think it's kind of more detail in those same areas. So definitely like the company vision. I know some companies obviously have career pages where, before you even click on the job posting, you'll get that picture. But if we're looking at, a job posting in and of itself, I think the value prop, role specifics, requirements, and maybe what success looks like in the role, plus next steps, right? So kind of those 4 or 5 components.
Got it.
What do you think, by the way? Do you have different advice there?
I agree with this. So our experience hiring salespeople is that we try to differentiate ourselves as much as we can in our outreach messages, in our job description. So we would share what the product does. We would share the a target ICP, client ICP, what the person will be talking to, what the person will be doing in their first 30, 60 days. We have a pretty neat onboarding process. I've heard of companies sharing their onboarding process. Like, this is what the onboarding process looks like. That's usually a very good material that you can share in your recruiting process, because that shows how much organized you are. That shows a lot of things about the product, about the clients that you're talking to. So yeah, I agree with this. And my experience has been that job descriptions for salespeople are usually very differentiated. They're less BS than engineers or other roles. So maybe because it's sales writing job descriptions themselves, and they are used to pitching things and organizing things in an understandable way. But yeah, it's very important to have very differentiated messaging, very differentiated wording that only you can use.
I agree. Although I think there are a lot of terrible sales job postings as well.
Sure.
But I think you're right. I mean, one thing that I aspire to do is just, which by the way, I struggle with, so I'm not claiming to be perfect here, but just to avoid buzzwords and jargon, right? I mean, if you can say in both your messaging and your job posting, I mean, everyone now is, making fun of references to unicorns and, and rocket ships, but that doesn't mean now we should be saying, hey, we're the best, at, efficient growth and, throwing out other buzzwords, right? It's like, just keep it plain and simple. Like, what do you do? Why does it matter? Who are your, we talk about this, who are your customers, if you can share. I like what you said about onboarding. What are next steps? What are the requirements? What's an idea? Sometimes you can even say like, here are the requirements. Here's what makes for an exceptional candidate. Like, give people that insight and lay out next steps. And also consider asking for referrals in all your messages. I mean, one thing that we're doing a lot of, is knowing that almost anyone in SaaS these days knows at least one person who's been impacted by layoffs. Like, make it clear that if they have referrals, you'd be delighted to get them.
Yeah, that's a good one as well. And moving on to the process, there is a lot to say on the process as well. What do you recommend here? What have you seen work to assess salespeople?
Yeah, I think the big thing is having some form of a structured process. So what we generally recommend is, and you mentioned this, right? It doesn't have to be 10 million things, but defining the key competencies and behaviors that you require for success. You can model that on what you've seen work in the organization or a hypothesis that you're making your first hire, but a thoughtful, here are the key competencies we need. And then essentially looking at, how do we assess and validate for these in a structured interview process? Generally, for sales hiring, it's typically, a 4 to 6 step process. Some people do it in 3. Sometimes you see the 7 to 8 step processes, but you're going to look at, obviously involving the hiring manager. That should be kind of, almost always first interview, right? And then looking at the potential to engage peers, often, a marketing organization, client success or customer success as well. And then an executive sponsor if required. And then generally looking at, based on what you can assess for relative to those competencies required, if there are certain things that are considered so critical to success that you've seen, considering, a role play or presentation step, typically at the tail end, as a way to really validate that this candidate has what's required to be successful in the role.
So there is a lot of theory on what is a significant proof of future success, and the common agreement is that it's a piece of work that you will then have to replicate during your actual work. So role plays work really well in sales, and that's probably the reason why they work so well. Do you have any recommendations on how to organize the role play, how to build that exercise?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. So it's hard to give a one set of instructions for all organizations, because I think it depends on the complexity of a sell and some of the role specifics. But in general, my guidance is keep it simple, right? Really think about what competencies do you need to see, in show versus tell mode in a way, right? So there are, at a certain level, think about the role play as like, here are the competencies that we think need to be shown, because some people are just good interviewers, right? And we want to see if this can be exhibited. Maybe it's business acumen or communication skills, or the ability to close or negotiate, right? But whatever those skills are, those competencies are defined, build the exercise around that. If you're gonna ask candidates to use your company, make sure that they get access to the required information to be able to build that pitch. Don't assume, as we talked about earlier, that they have. Don't make it harder for them to complete it because they don't have that industry background. So making sure you give them those instructions and guidance, have it documented, minimize how much homework they need to do. I think it's important that we're all respectful of candidate time. If you want to build a great candidate brand and experience, right? Don't ask people to invest 20 hours of time preparing for something, but or if you're going to, like, you should probably consider offering them compensation. But you can certainly have them present on your company. Again, if you can provide the materials needed, or you can ask them to pitch, a prior company. If you're going to do that, I think it's important as well to be mindful that they may not be able to share sensitive information based on confidentiality considerations. And 2, if it's a role play, make sure that you are taking the time to learn the roles that are required to enable them to, effectively execute, right? So if they're asking you to pretend like you're an FP&A person, right? Like, you need to take a minute to make sure you understand how to emulate that role so you can enable that exercise to be meaningful. And then the last thing I think is most important is that if you're going to have multiple interviewers participate in one mock or role play, they need to attend all of them, right? You can't have an executive popping in on one, then not joining the other one, right? It's really important that you define who's required, right, and who's not. I would avoid having people optionally sit in these things, because ultimately then you're not getting a level of rigor in the assessment that the candidate deserves and that you need to make a great decision.
There's a book that we both mentioned when preparing for that episode, was The Sales Acceleration Formula by Mark Roberge.
Yeah.
It talks in depth about the role play and exercise and case study. I don't remember what he called it exactly. But he explained that basically the idea is to replicate the actual work that the person will then have. And it has a lot of ways to think about this case study. One of the part is to assess how the person reacts to feedback. That's one
Yes.
thing, the thing that we've been doing at Hire Suite. So basically, at the end of the case study, you'll give them a feedback. We also have that culture, but I believe it's shared among a lot of sales teams. And so you have to show how yourself get feedback. Like this was positive, this can be improved, and try and make it very useful for the candidate as well, almost like a coaching session, and see how the person reacts to this and how and what they would do differently. So I don't remember exactly because I read that book a long time ago, but I remember that this part was very interesting on how to build a case study. It's called the sales acceleration formula again.
One of the best hires I've ever made had done, it was for a management role, and had done a 30-60-90 presentation, and we were a little disappointed in what was delivered. We shared that feedback and invited her back to present again, and she crushed it, and nice. She's gone on to do exceptional things as a sales leader. And so I think that's a great example of the power of seeing how people react. I mean, that's coachability, right? And what's important about, I don't remember if Mark's book discusses this, but coachability, oftentimes people think about it as, can someone take hard feedback and smile and nod and give you the reactions that make you feel happy? That's part of it, right? But the key thing is, can they implement the guidance into better practice, right? And I think that can be, right there is a great example of where, a role play or presentation step, particularly if you have an organization that has, a culture of coaching excellence, right? That's something you may want to validate versus simply interviewing for, right?
And then, so that's for the interview process. Try to have it as structured as possible. Do you have anything to say about, so there is a lot of biases in recruiting. I feel that sales recruiting might be the less biased of all recruiting areas, because it's very easy after 6 months to just reflect and know who are the good salespeople. So not exactly because people will then progress, but probably easier than on an engineering or marketing or CS role. So it's easy to see, did a person hit their quota? How much did they do? And so you have very short feedback loops, and those feedback loops tend to limits the biases because it's very easy to try something and see the results. But do you have anything to say about biases in recruiting salespeople, how to limit this, or the benefits of even limiting those biases?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what we discussed at the outset. Even the industry insider fallacy, as I call it, is a form of a bias. I mean, in this case, a bias against certain forms of experience or in favor of certain experiences over others. But biases come in many different formats in interviewing. But I think you're spot on, right? I mean, anyone who's managed sales teams knows, I mean, there's something about it that's just the results orientation of everything you do in sales is at a certain level, like such a great way to like clear bias out of the way, right? Because ultimately when you're focused on results and the path to achieve them, right, you want to be supportive of, whatever background or walk of life gets you there, right? It's such a great counter to bias and cronyism. But in hiring and recruiting, I think people often have a tendency to preconceive what a great candidate should look like. And, so we've seen a lot of that. I think it's one of the reasons why, women and ethnic minorities don't comprise as large a percentage of the sales population as they otherwise should. And so a lot of the literature and content on mitigating bias to promote diversity hiring, I think is spot on. Bias comes in many different other flavors as well, as we discussed. And so I think having a structured process, always being mindful of how I'm always really cautious about sort of rapport building and looking for commonality in interviewing, right? Once you start to get attentive to the fact that somebody went to the same college or was on the same, lacrosse team as you, if that was your sport or whatever else, right? It's obviously great to build a relationship that might make you feel more comfortable, but then you're interviewing another candidate who maybe spent, 12 years in the military, right? And then went into construction work, to pay the bills, right? Do you want to bias things against that person because you didn't serve in the military yourself and don't have, background in construction, right? So it's really important to have, I think, a certain level of structure and formality, make everybody comfortable in a very egalitarian way, because that's how you hire the people that, as you mentioned, that are going to come into your organization and be the most likely to succeed.
Yeah, and the best way to really mitigate the biases are probably to work on the exercise or case study or role play, and just make sure that it's that people can really show their worth. It's a good way to do this. Okay, and final question: you were a sales yourself. Now you're helping companies hire people. What are your closing techniques that you can share with the audience to make sure that the ideal candidate closes in the end? They have tens of different options. So how do we make sure they sign with us? What can you share?
I mean, we have a good track record for our clients. I mean, our placement rates, time to placement. Happy to share those metrics, but it's probably like standard sales, right? We never want to be salesy or pushy with candidates. I really want candidates that I've recruited to make the best decision for themselves, and even if they've got 3 or 4 options to choose from, and my client role is one of those 3 or 4. I really see my job as being to be as impartial of a guide as I can to them, to encourage them to have the tough conversations with, my client if there are gaps in compensation or other concerns or just things they want to, better vet, right? So, I believe that the better I do that job at, obviously I work for my clients, right? I need to help them achieve their goals. But if we can't close one candidate because they have better opportunities elsewhere, rather than fretting that, right, I'm going to go work harder to find more pipeline elsewhere for them, or to call out the issues that are standing in the way of them making those closes. So it's
no secret.
Recruiting, it's people's lives, right? And obviously, if I'm being pushy or manipulative, they might join my client organization, but those might be the candidates then who are more likely to churn in a few months anyhow, and that's not good for my clients or for my reputation or for the candidates, right?
All right, perfect. I appreciate that answer. Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me.